Hello everyone, my name is Jessica and I'm the creator of Once Upon a Pesto. Today is a really exciting conversation that we're about to have about food and recipes in Australia and New Zealand. And joining us is none other than Tansy, who is an Australian living in New Zealand. And so she is a cookbook author, a blogger, her cookbook is called Joyful Eating, so I encourage you to follow her. Her handle is Tansy_Joyful Eating. And she also publishes children's books, one that is called The Superheroes on Your Plate. So really excited to have her today. Again, this conversation is going to be about food and recipes in Australia and New Zealand, or Down Under, as we are calling it. It's a wonderful conversation. I'm so excited to have her joining us all the way from New Zealand. And again, she is an Aussie living in New Zealand, a well published cookbook author. She loves writing. She focuses on mindful eating. So this idea of, focusing on, there she is.
Hello.
I will stop the introduction and let you introduce yourself. Tansy, thank you so much for joining me today. Just telling everyone, you are in New Zealand, you're from Australia,
Yep.
You're a cookbook author, everything. It's just so exciting. So I want to open this conversation. First, give us a little introduction about yourself, and what got you into the cooking world and going from New Zealand, or from Australia to New Zealand.
Yeah. I suppose for me, like, I've always been interested in food. Like, it's something I've loved since I was a child, but I probably came from it more from that perspective of like how to eat right and healthy. And it was probably, became a little bit unhealthy, that sort of thinking, like looking at different diets and stuff like that. So my interest now is very much more so about our relationship to food and our behaviours and habits and beliefs around food. And I suppose I'm in New Zealand because my husband got a job here, and we sort of weren't sure where we wanted to live. Like, we've moved around Australia a few times, and it was just a great opportunity, and we didn't really know where we wanted to live in Australia. We'd sold our house and we were sort of on the road, so an opportunity came up here, and yeah, we really love it. It's a beautiful country.
Wonderful. And, for people not watching, or for people who are watching who may not know, what is, Australia and New Zealand, they're in the Pacific Ocean. The distance is very far. For example, it's 7 p.m. here. It's 1 p.m. the next day there, your time.
Yeah.
So how long was that move from Australia to New Zealand? If you were to fly back to Australia, how long is that flight?
It's only a few hours. It's like 3 hours from Brisbane, or 2.5 to Sydney. So it's not too far, but yeah, it's a lot further apart than people realise. I think that's probably one of the things, you get questions about how far are they from each other, or can you see New Zealand from Australia, or something like that. They are a long way apart, and there's a lot of cultural similarities, but there's a lot of distinctions between them. And I think even as Australians, we're a little bit ignorant to those differences as well. Like, we sort of think of New Zealand as little brother, like we're sort of, there's a little bit of rivalry and fun between the two countries, but there is there's quite distinct culture and food culture and history as well. So they are quite different.
Well, let's get into that difference. What was, the first thing that stood out to you in transitioning from Australia to New Zealand, both in general culture and then specifically the food culture?
So we actually live on the South Island, and so like New Zealand only has 5 million people, and South Island, has 1 million of those people. So it's a large area. Like, it takes hours and hours to drive, from the length, one end to the other. So it is a big country, and it has very different geographical elements. Like, you've got the ocean, and then you've got the mountains and snow-capped mountains and stuff like that. But I think, it's very country. People are a lot more traditional. There's a lot more community feeling. So to me, it felt a little bit like going back in time. What I had imagined Australia was like 50 years ago, where people were just friendly and helpful. We had people just picking us up from the side of the road and asking if we needed to get somewhere, and people helping us out, and obviously you get that in Australia as well, but it's definitely much more pronounced here, is that community feel, and looking out for each other. It's much more prominent in the culture. And I think Australians pride themselves on how laid back they are. But I think
Okay.
New Zealanders take that to the next level. They're just really laid back. They don't really, like, there's not the same uptightness about appearance or, like I would say economically, people are probably not as well off, but they're just really like just get on with it attitude around life, and really enjoy family and community. That's a really high priority here.
Wonderful. And food wise, you know it best. I've been following your promotions for this conversation, and some really, really interesting things that I don't know much about. So Tansy, tell us, let's start with Australia. Let's dig apart what Australia cuisine is like. What stands out, if it's a certain dish or certain ingredients. How would you summarize it?
Yeah, I've always found this really hard when I've traveled around the world, like what is truly Australian, because we don't have a very strong food culture. Like both Australia and New Zealand are fairly young countries. And so there's certain foods. I suppose it's very much a meat and three veg culture. There's a lot of British influence. So the food would be very similar to that. Like when it comes to a main meal, it would be sort of meat and three veg would be traditional. And then, things like takeaways like meat pies, sausage rolls, fish and chips, that sort of thing. But I think in both countries, but particularly in Australia, they're so multicultural, and other cultures have come into Australia when we were sort of in our infancy. So, Chinese and a lot of Mediterranean cultures. So we have a huge fusion. Like Australians generally will eat a real mix of foods, and whether it's in the home or you go to a restaurant, you're getting all sorts of different things. But also, I think Australians aren't so stuck in the traditional way. So we really just take bits and pieces of different cultures that we like or that have ingredients that we can access, and we just put them all together. And so then you can have just really weird dishes that might be a bit Greek and a bit Thai and something else all just fused together. So I'd say that's, if I'm using an Australian word, it's like this bastardized recipe, really. Like we just mix everything all up together. And that's very Australian. And I think there's a lot of similarities in New Zealand in the same way, but New Zealanders are a lot more traditional, and they like to follow recipes in the traditional way or have traditional names. Like, Australians, we love to shorten words and give them nicknames and stuff like that. So even, you might know pavlova, but we'll call it a pav or something like, we sort of, or even a sandwich, we'll call it a sarnie. So we have these sort of nicknames for foods, and I think Australians in particular will just, there's not a proper way, I suppose, to make certain things. Yeah.
Great. And let's talk a little bit about, what is pav, as you call it, or pavlova. You posted a picture of it, so let's talk a little bit about what that is and why it is unique to the area.
Yes, so pavlova is an interesting one. It's one of the foods that New Zealand and Australia fight over. So it seems that it originated in New Zealand, but Australia has taken it as its own, and it's a dessert. So it's like a meringue, I suppose. It's like egg white and sugar beaten together and then baked, and generally it's made to the size of a cake, and then you put cream on top and fruits. And I suppose one of the things with New Zealand and Australia is it's our summer in for Christmas. So something like a pavlova with lots of fresh summer fruits would be, something we'd have for Christmas, and we call it bring a plate, when we get together, and it's something that we have in celebrations and stuff like that over the summer period. And And yeah, you might see online like little wreaths and things made with meringues and
Right.
fruits. And I suppose when it comes to Christmassy things, it's like fresh and cold because it's hot this time of the year in both
Mhm.
countries, and even more so in Australia. Like I'd say, New Zealand follows things traditionally as well because it's not as cold hot in the Christmas period.
Yeah, and a great point I want to flag here for everyone watching. In the northern hemisphere, it's winter here, Christmas time, but for Australia and New Zealand, it's summer season during Christmas. So a really interesting kind of twist to what the different cultures see and experience during this time of the year. And
Mm.
great pointing out the traditional desserts. What else, thinking of Christmas coming up, are there other dishes, standout dishes that growing up as a family are very typical in either Australia or New Zealand at mealtime come Christmas?
Mm. I'd say there's still like a lot of families that would do the traditional, ham and roast veggies and stuff like that. But I think particularly in Australia, there's less holding on to those traditions. So it's more about seasonal produce. So we might do like prawns and like mango salad, or we might have fruit platters, potato salads. And I suppose like when I think of meat for Christmas, I'm really thinking like my memories is more about the cold meats, like the leftovers, because that's something worked really well with our climate, and a lot of people just don't want to be slaving over a hot stove this time of the year. So people will have barbecues, or fresh New Zealand salmon for Christmas. So it's some families will be quite traditional, and you'll have the usual roast, but like things like turkey isn't very big in Australia or New Zealand. So turkey that wouldn't be on most people's menu. So it might be some lamb or some pork roast or something like that would be quite traditional. But people might just do like a gourmet barbecue or something like that for Christmas as well. Mm.
Sounds good. And let's talk a little bit more about barbecue and what are the meats that are involved in that, and what's the culture around the barbecue. Here in America we think barbecue as out grilling burgers in the summertime, but it might be a little bit different where you are. So tell us a little bit about what it means and what's
Yeah,
involved.
I would say it's similar, but sausages. I think you've got on your website the sausage sizzle. Like that's something in both countries where, like, if you're doing a fundraiser, you might cook sausages out the front of a hardware store or something like that, or schools will have that. So often it will be a sausage, like a pork and beef sausage, or we don't really call them hamburger patties. Like we call a hamburger the entire thing. So like we would call it like a burger patty. Generally it will be lamb or beef or something like that, or just a steak. I think it's just part of our culture. It's something that's easy, something you can have outside. You can have it when it's hot. You can have a few beers, chatting outside. So that's definitely a big part of the culture. I think just being outside and just being relaxed, really.
Great. And growing up, was that something that it involves kids up to adults, or was it more for the adults? What was that like?
Yeah, it's all ages. It's sort of like just get outside with a trampoline and water
Mm.
pistols and like it's just fun. And I think that's the thing for Christmas. Like I think of dripping watermelon down my chin, or water bombs, and because for us Christmas we had to have activities that were going to keep us cool, and generally we're outdoors, and generally like our Boxing Day will be a big picnic day, so it'll either be a barbecue or take a picnic blanket to a park or the beach or something like that. And it's barbecue and ice creams and leftover sandwiches and stuff like that from Christmas Day. So it's definitely a busy time outdoors, generally for Christmas and Boxing Day.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's the warm time of the year. So
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And Tansy, I can't help but ask this question. I know people who are watching or will watch later are, expecting this question. Talk to us about Vegemite. What is it? How do you eat it? What does it taste like?
Okay. So it's sort of a very salty, savory taste. It's made out of yeast and salt, essentially. And it's very high in B vitamins. So it was I can't even remember when it was invented, like the 1920s, I think. And it was pretty much like marketed as a supplement for B vitamins. And generally we will have it on toast with butter or crackers or something like that. It's a very acquired taste, and most Australians grow up on it. And Vegemite's definitely very big in Australia, and New Zealand has like a bit of a Marmite Vegemite thing going on where it's like half and half. And Marmite is the British version of Vegemite. So you'll find that in Britain, and it's a little bit sweeter. It's got a bit of sugar added, but pretty much Vegemite is salt and yeast, and it's black, and it's just usually it's just like a thin serve that you would have. You don't eat a lot of it because it's quite strong. And here they have like a grilled cheese sandwich that they do, Vegemite and cheese, and they call them mouse traps. I'm not really sure. It's like a cheese sandwich with Vegemite and cheese that's really popular here. And you can find it in like scrolls, like sort of like a savoury bun, I suppose. So it is used for a few other things, and you could use it like in soup or something like that. It tastes a little bit like stock, really.
Wow.
Yeah.
I definitely learned something there. And is it if you eat it on toast, is that something, breakfast, lunch, snack, any time of day?
Pretty much any time of day. It would be anything but dinner. So generally, like it's pretty common as a breakfast to have toast and Vegemite, but it would be very common lunch as well. Vegemite sandwiches, and then afternoon tea. We have these biscuits that are very dry called Sayo biscuits in Australia, and they're just a very dry biscuit, and Vegemite on those for afternoon tea was pretty common as well. So it's pretty much all day, anytime.
It shows it's versatile, right?
Yeah.
And Tansy, what does throughout the day, if you're talking the meals and snacks, what is the meal or time of day, tea, whatever it be, that's really focused on coming together and enjoying that food? If there's one that stands out in Australia, maybe it's different in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. I'd definitely say it's dinner time that we get together. Like I think, particularly now, like breakfast is in a rush. We're generally eating lunch at work out of a lunchbox or getting takeaways. So dinner would be the time a family gets together. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's where the weekend barbecues and things like that come in, is like it's just a way to really spend a lot of time together as a family and enjoy that time. But yeah, unfortunately, I think like the rest of the world, we're having less and less time together at the dinner table, and you can really see that. And yeah, it's definitely a real push to just try to get people to the table and to enjoy food, and that's something I'm very passionate about as well, is just spending time together and being present with what you're eating rather than like on the run. And like there's a lot of separate meals being eaten, like children eating at a certain time and parents at a different time as well. But yeah, dinner's definitely your main important meal of the day, I suppose.
Great. And Tansy, if there is one dinner entree or side dish that you hold true to your heart from Australian cuisine, what would it be? And you can list a few. I know one would probably be hard to think of.
There's so many things. I think, like having some chips on the side of something is definitely a big Australian thing. And there's sort of like fat chips, like British style chips rather than your French fries, which are quite skinny. So they're sort of more potato-y. Yeah, I think that's what I find very hard. It's like often the foods that we think of very Australian are more of our snack foods. Like it would be like a sausage roll or a meat pie or chips or like a dessert, like snack foods, different types of biscuits that are very Australian or New Zealand, things like a lamington. Whereas meals, not really. Like it's funny when there's an Australian restaurant, you're like, what are they going to cook? Like it's more about using Australian ingredients, and that's probably the main thing. It's like things like mango and barramundi, which is a white fish, macadamia nuts. So like if you're going to go to an Australian restaurant, it'd be more so about the Australian ingredients that they're bringing into it. And the same with New Zealand. Like New Zealand is much more seasonal than Australia. So we have, like in Australia, you've pretty much got winter and summer. Like there's not, this massive difference. And most produce is available all year round. So you could make a stir fry any time of the year. Whereas New Zealand is much more seasonal. So you sort of think, so there's a lot more sort of pride and enjoyment of whatever's in season, whether it's potatoes. They go crazy over potatoes for a few months, and then it's asparagus, and then it's stone fruit, and then it's something else. So it's that seasonality and bringing that into other dishes, I suppose, is probably what I think of as Australian.
I love that you mentioned, particular ingredients, the mangoes, macadamia nuts. I'm blanking on a few, but talk to us a little bit more about ingredients that you find in these two countries, these island nations, that you won't find elsewhere in the world. We talked about Vegemite, but is there a certain meat or a certain produce item that's grown solely in Australia or New Zealand?
Not particularly. Like in Australia, you can get access to like game meat or like kangaroo or crocodile, and both countries are using a lot more traditional herbs from the indigenous cultures, but it's not incredibly widespread. So there's not that many foods that I would say that you'd be like, yes, that's a Kiwi food or that's an Australian food. It's more some of the recipes, I would say, than the ingredients. But like I suppose in New Zealand it's like cheese and wine and you'd think of those sorts of things, lamb, and Australia, you'd be thinking more like prawns and tropical fruits and stuff like that.
Okay. And we have a question here. I wanted to elaborate on it. The mention of crocodile and kangaroo meat. Benjamin is in Germany. Tell us about what is kangaroo meat like for those of us who've never tried it. What does it compare to, and how do you prepare it?
It's it's a lean meat, so it doesn't have a lot of fat in it, and it'd be very gamey. So like, wild caught deer or something like that in other countries. And you'd prepare it in the same sort of way. Like it's something that you'd probably marinate to sort of soften it and get some juices in there and that sort of thing. And then just barbecue it. So generally it'd be like in burgers or like a steak on the barbecue or something like that.
Okay. Is it for special occasions or pretty much any time of the year?
Any time of the year. Like I wouldn't say it's hot, like incredibly common, but it's it's available, and people do eat it, and it's that we do have an overabundance of kangaroos in Australia, so it's a good meat to eat, and it's an incredibly healthy meat to eat as well.
That sounds great, and I'm sure it's of interest to you in your pursuit of the different non-diet nutrition and things like that you do. So that's fantastic. And Tansy, I wanted to ask you, speaking of your cookbooks and the children's cookbook that you've been promoting recently, thinking back to your childhood, what was it like growing up, and when did you start to explore the kitchen?
So I actually grew up vegetarian, and I think I was always curious. So my books, I write recipes on my blog and share things on Instagram, but my books are more so just to inspire curiosity. So my book Joyful
Mm.
Eating is more of a philosophy around our relationship to food than it's not an actual cookbook. And the same with my children's book. It's a story that introduces different types of foods. Um, so yeah, I've always been curious about food and making different recipes. And I was one of those kids who would like try things and make a complete mess. We have a drink here called Milo, which is like a powdered chocolate drink. And I remember when I was a kid, like I was quite young, and I got like this ginormous can of this Milo, and I thought if I add milk to it, I could maybe make chocolate or something. And I remember getting in trouble for that because it was like a whole tin of Milo that I destroyed. But I've always been really curious about how things are made, where they come from. And when it comes to recipe writing, I'm quite inventive. Like I like to look at different options rather than like, this is the way to make this dish. It's more like, how could we modify this depending on your chosen way of eating or the ingredients you have access to. So I'm probably sort of an intuitive and curious cook. And I like to sort of share that so that when people are trying a recipe, they don't feel like they're bound by
Mm.
those ingredients, because it can be, particularly if we're talking about different countries, you might be able to access cashews, but someone else can get walnuts. And, you can modify things that way. But also, like if you're vegetarian versus a meat eater, then it's how would you modify the recipe for that as well?
Hmm. Do you have a recipe that you're most proud of in terms of those different kinds of substitutions?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I haven't actually written this recipe yet, but I do lots of grain bowl type things where I'll like do
Mm.
roast veggies and grains and like some sort of dressing. And so it's usually just to throw a lot of different things together. That's something that I eat a lot of and I really enjoy. But things like avocado mousse is a delicious recipe that I've worked with. Yeah, I'm sort of one of those sort of people that like try something and then moves on to the next thing as well.
Keeps it exciting, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Tansy, I want to ask you, very broadly speaking, thought you were thinking about this conversation and different foods and recipes between Australia and New Zealand. Is there anything that stands out in your mind as you're thinking about this upcoming chat that we haven't talked about yet?
Let me just think. Um, I think that's pretty much everything, but I think it's probably more that we have very distinct foods rather than necessarily a culture. Like it's sort of like breakfast will be wheat bix or porridge. Like wheat bix is sort of like I don't even know how to, like a flaky biscuit essentially, made out of wheat. So it's more like we have things that we're proud of or things that we
Mhm.
really attach our identity to, in a sense of like, that's Australian, and we have a pride in that being Australian. So um, I think that's probably the main thing. And we're very open to trying different things as well. Um, mm. And yeah, like I was just thinking then, probably, avocado toast. I don't know if that's the biggest, very big Australian food. That's, I know when I've traveled the other parts of the world, that's seen as something that's quite Australian to do things like that. And I suppose you've got the English breakfast, which is, your eggs and bacon, but here we sort of, throw in lots of veggies and sprouts, and,
Hmm.
it's quite a different, a lot fresher version of some of those sorts of dishes. So probably, yeah, it's a bit of a fresh side to things because it suits the climate, and the produce that we have as well.
Fantastic. And you said that early on in the conversation that there really aren't these standout um, food traditions in these two countries, but based on our conversation, there's definitely there's pride. There's certain ingredients, and so I would walk away saying that there is. It's just something that you can't compare to the country of Italy, but it's unique in its own way, right?
Yeah, definitely. Mm.
That's awesome. And Tansy, I want to wrap this conversation up. Thank you so much for your time. But last thing, I want to give you the opportunity to tell everyone who's watching and who will watch afterwards where we can find your work, both online and in book form.
Yeah. So you can find me on the website joyfuleatingnutrition.com, and you can find links to my books there. And I have some more books coming out next year that really follow a foods journey as well. Because I suppose, I just want to make food fun. Like, I suppose the concept of joyful eating is that food is something that is enjoyable, and it's something that connects us to our senses as well. And we do have a culture that, we're afraid to enjoy food. So that's something that I really like to bring in my work. And then obviously on Instagram, I'm at Tansy_joyful eating, and you can find me a few other places there. But my books are available on most of your online platforms as well.
Great. I'm so excited to, keep an eye out for the upcoming books. I encourage everyone watching to do the same and follow Tansy on Instagram here for more. So thank you so much, Tansy, for your time your afternoon and my evening.
Yeah.
It's been such a joy learning about Australian and New Zealand's cooking, food, recipes, culture, and everything. One day I do hope to make it there. And so thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us today.
No worries. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great.
You're welcome. Bye, Tansy.
All right. Bye.